Hello and welcome back. This final lecture on chapter 14, just wrapping up a few outstanding points. Now this is probably of this chapter the bit that's least likely to attract many questions, and when I do come up to a bit which I think the examiner particularly likes, I will mention it to you. Regulation of externalities, just a reminder really, because we have touched on this already. We know that the government will regulate an industry to take into account those external costs and benefits, things that aren't necessarily picked up by the free market. And we talked about pollution and environmental damage, remember, we talked about fracking, for instance. But also certain benefits, the benefits of education, the benefits of, the welfare of society. So how will the government do this? Well, price regulations, we've seen those already. Indirect tax and tariffs, which again will influence demand and supply for products. Subsidies, for example, to encourage our exports, because that would be good for our balance of payments. And just direct regulation, so quotas, set a limit on the amount of output of a particular product. Set standards like health and safety rules, and also enforcement, fines on businesses that don't meet those necessary standards. Maybe even by a licensing system where you can withdraw the license if businesses don't comply. The next thing we need to look at is the regulation of people in a business. Now, this is largely revision if you've already taken your law module. Not really one of the examiner's favourite topics, although he could throw the odd question in. And the reason I say that is because, of course, he gets a chance to test this sort of knowledge in detail in your law paper. But you must be aware of these rules. So how do we regulate people in a business? Well, one thing we need to know about is insider dealing. Now, insider dealing is where somebody who has particular inside knowledge, and the notes there says people in the know, about a business, and they use that to make a profit. So, for instance, if you're the finance director of a company, and you know that the company is about to issue a profits warning, you quickly rush out and sell all your shares. That would be insider dealing. Similarly, if you were to rush home and tell your wife and your parents to sell all their shares because the company's share price is about to fall, that would also be insider dealing. And you could also be charged under the insider dealing legislation, in that case, with passing on sensitive information, because you're using that knowledge, that special knowledge that you had as a result of your job, to gain some sort of competitive advantage, get some sort of gain. Now, that's a crime, which means that if you want to convict someone of insider dealing, you have to pass the criminal burden of proof. So you must prove an intention to carry out that crime, and you must prove it beyond reasonable doubt. It's quite hard to do that. So we also have something called the market abuse regulations. Now, this is a code of conduct issued by the FSA. And it sets out basically the standards of behaviour for anyone who's engaged in dealings on the stock market. And it's really wide. It's wider than insider dealing, although it would cover insider dealing. But it covers any sort of behaviour that distorts the operation of the markets. So, for instance, if you were to create a rumour about a particular company with the aim of driving up the share price, if you were to try and take steps to give the impression that, you were trying to buy up a particular company when actually you weren't. So manipulating devices to try and spread information or distort the price, some sort of, purchasing program that gobbles up shares. Anything like that distorts the market could amount to market abuse. And as I say, it's civil. Therefore, the standard of proof will be the balance of probabilities. If you are a company director, you need to be aware of the fraudulent and wrongful trading rules. Remember, these are to create a civil liability for a director of a company if he has been a director of a company which has become insolvent. So fraudulent trading, first of all, dealing with the civil issue, which is where a director of a company that has become insolvent carried on the business with the intent to defraud creditors, or for any other fraudulent purpose. It's quite wide. And actually, this particular provision doesn't have to be a director. It can be anybody involved in the management of the company. And if you are involved in running a business for a fraudulent purpose, then you will be asked to contribute to that company's funds out of your personal wealth. Now, there is also a criminal offence related to fraudulent trading. That's a different thing, and obviously the criminal offence you must prove beyond reasonable doubt. Because of the stigma attached to the fraudulent trading rules, particularly you must show dishonesty, quite often the wrongful trading rules would be used instead. Now, these rules really are there to say, well, if a director realises, or at least should have realised, that this business wasn't going to make it, he must stop trading. He can't keep running up debts and saying, well, it's okay, the company has limited liability. He must actually draw things to a halt and protect the company's creditors. So we don't need fraud here. And again, the director, if he is guilty of wrongful trading, will be asked to contribute to the assets of the company. So what is wrongful trading? Well, this is the definition. The director knew, or he should have known, that there was no reasonable prospect of the company avoiding insolvent liquidation. Now, the defence to that is that he took steps to protect the creditors. He did this for the right reason. He was trying to save the company and he was protecting the creditors at the same time. If he can't show that, then he may well have that liability to the company. Now, be careful, because as a qualified chartered accountant, you will owe a higher duty in respect of these fraudulent and wrongful trading rules. Because when it says the director knew or should have known, as a qualified accountant, you have a higher standard of care. It's assumed that, yes, you should have known that the company could not avoid insolvent liquidation. As a director of a company, you could also be caught under the Company Directors Disqualification Act. So if you're involved in the mismanagement of a company, and the list is quite big, things like insider dealing, fraudulent wrongful trading, breach of the competition laws, generally being unfit to be a company director, these are all reasons why you could be disqualified under the CDDA. And what happens is either the Office of Fair Trading, or if the company is insolvent, the liquidator winding up the company will report to the court and make a recommendation that you should be disqualified. And it can be for up to 10 years, so it's quite a long time. And then finally, I'd mention money laundering. Now, the money laundering regulations are pretty extensive and they're tested in the law papers, so I'd be surprised if they came up here. But just to be aware, then the Proceeds of Crime Act and the money laundering regulations operate to place a responsibility on certain professionals, and they have 3 potential offences that they could be convicted of. The first one is the offence of money laundering, and this is where you help to take the proceeds of crime and you help to make them appear legitimate. Okay, so perhaps by helping to place those proceeds of crime into a legitimate business. So you could be guilty of money laundering, we hope not. More likely is that you might find yourself falling foul of these rules, failure to report. Because if you are suspicious that somebody has been involved in money laundering, then you have to make a report to SOCA about that. And the final one is tipping off. Once you've made a report, you mustn't let your client or the person you're suspicious of know about that report, because once they know about that, they'll go away and destroy all the evidence. So you could also be charged with an offence of tipping off if you let the cat out of the bag. There are also money laundering regulations, and these really insist that businesses must put in place certain procedures to implement the money laundering legislation. Things like know your client procedures, training for your staff, record keeping, things like that. Now, finally, a word about international legislation. And again, I think this is more of a sort of awareness than anything else. But global regulation is increasingly complicated, and different companies have different amounts of influence. It mentions here the US has huge influence, and that the UK is, moving up to be second to the US. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but certainly being aware of which companies are players in a particular market. And I would say that some of the emerging economies are going to be increasingly powerful here. So we're talking Brazil, Russia, India and China. Of course, there's the EU, again, as a big international player, massive in implementing different amounts of regulation over various industries. Also be aware of those international organisations, the World Trade Organization, whose job it is to encourage international trade and remove barriers to trade, but also the International Monetary Fund and the International Chamber of Commerce. Remembering, of course, that companies are not always able to compete internationally because of local laws. For instance, regulation on maybe licensing of drug companies, maybe barriers that countries put up to prevent international competition, and we'll look at those in a moment. So why would we want to encourage international trade? Well, to be honest, it's much of the same reasons that we've already looked at for competition in general, but obviously on a larger scale. But one key point that we probably haven't talked about yet is the doctrine of comparative advantage. This is the idea that countries should do what they're best at, or at the very least, what they're least worst at. Because if every country specialised in what they were best at, then the world as a whole would be better off. Everybody would be able to make more and do it more efficiently. We'd make better use of the world's scarce resources. Now, two phrases here that you might see in an exam question, which is the benefits of industrialisation. Import substitution is where we try to swap our imports for homegrown goods. Okay, so perhaps we will protect our local producers, maybe with a subsidy, maybe put in a tariff against the imports. We're also looking for export-led growth. We're really hoping that we can grow our markets by selling our goods overseas. Now, there's a list here of reasons why international trade is good. We've talked about specialisation already. What about allocation of raw materials? It's very likely, isn't it, that one country will have more of a particular raw material than it needs, whilst another might not have enough. And trade gives an advantage to even out access to those raw materials and to share those raw materials that different countries may have. Competition. We've already said why competition is good, but if we're looking at worldwide competition, then that means that each country is less likely to be dominated by a monopoly. It means that each country's industry is going to be forced to be more competitive, more efficient, and therefore that's got to be good for the customer. They'll get better choice, better innovation. Linked to that is access to larger markets, because if you're going to invest in developing new processes and so on, if you've got economies of scale, it's much more worthwhile. If you're a country thinking, well, I live in quite a small island, it's not really worth investing in this new product because I can only sell 500,000 of my products. However, if you're competing internationally, you've got access to worldwide markets. You might be able to sell billions of your products. Therefore, you can make the products more cheaply, and it's worth investing in innovation and developing new ideas because you can recoup your investment against a much larger market. Finally, trading links and political links. We are generally unlikely to go to war with our close trading allies. It generally helps to improve international relationships. Now, this note here, although we do like to think that international trade is increasingly common and very easy, you've got to remember that there are there are barriers to that. For instance, it's very good if China can make products very, very cheaply, but we do have to take into account that once it's made those products, they do have to be transported to those overseas markets, which may cancel out the savings they made initially. Okay, now the final section I want to mention to you, barriers to free trade. Now, we've mentioned a couple of times that governments may want to protect their home industries. We mentioned about protecting, say, agriculture as a stable home industry. We might want to help protect an industry while it grows, while it gets big enough to compete on the international market. Now, we call this protectionism, and it's worth being aware of a few different ways in which governments might seek to do this. First of all, customs duties or tariffs, basically a tax on imports, will make our imports more expensive, which will make it easier for our home market to compete because the goods that have been produced in your home turf will be comparatively cheaper than the imports. It's always a risky strategy because if you place a tariff on an import from another nation, they're probably going to do the same thing to you. You might go for an import quota, which is a restriction on the quantity of a product that can be brought into the country. Now, it's worth taking a second to understand how that might work. Now, if you restrict the number of foreign goods coming into the country, that means that there may be a shortage of those goods in your home nation. Now, if goods are in short supply, then you're likely to push the price up for those goods. Demand and supply means that customers will continue to demand them, but the price will go up, which eventually will mean that customers buy fewer of those goods, but at a higher price. Ideally, you would hope that the domestic producers would start to produce more of those goods and fill the gap between demand and supply, which eventually may bring the price down again. An embargo is a complete ban on goods coming into the country. So if you like, it's the ultimate in import quotas. As I mentioned earlier, there is always a risk of retaliation when you try and place restrictions on imports into your country. And for that reason, we may see that governments resort to hidden remedies to try and protect their home markets. And there's a whole range of things that they might try to do. For instance, if we are exporting goods, the government might provide export credit guarantees. And this is a commercial guarantee for if the overseas purchaser doesn't pay for the goods they've ordered. It's like an insurance policy backed by the government to try and encourage our businesses to take that risk and export their goods overseas. We might also offer grants to particular industries to try and help encourage investment or to help them to compete more effectively. For imports, we can try and be a bit clever there. We don't need to place an embargo or a quota on imports. We could try and have complicated import regulations, document rules that make it difficult for products to be brought into our country. We might insist on special safety checks that, again, make it harder to bring those products in, or possibly some sort of safety standard that isn't required in other markets, so that producers would have to make those goods especially for our market if they want to import goods into the UK. Now, as I mentioned, I think this last lecture is just wrapping up a few extra points. I don't think it's a source of many questions in the exam. Okay, so this is your last chapter, so you need to go away now and practice as many questions as you can. There's no substitute for doing the questions. Make sure you read the answers carefully though. Don't just learn which one is the right answer, but make sure you understand fully why that question is the right answer. And if there's any you're not sure about, make a list and then give your tutor a call, get him to help you. I wish you the best of luck with the exam. You should aim to take it within a couple of weeks of finishing the course.